Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson, Michael Grumbine, and Dan Coates.
Yeah, and before all of those people was J.R. Tolkien and his ideas. And that's what we're going to get into. We're actually not reading his fiction. We're not reading about the world he created directly. We're reading about all his ideas about it. And that means we're reading about his famous essay on fairy stories.
Which we have referenced quite a bit.
Yeah.
And which my co-hosts were, thank you, Dan. My co-hosts were gracious enough to finally give in to my whining about how we should actually do a podcast about on fairy stories, because I think that this essay will give us a lot of insight as we continue to read Tolkien, and it'll give us a lot to reflect on about what we just read in the Silmarillion about Tolkien's own ideas about what a proper fairy story is. And spoiler, fairy stories have become what we now call fantasy, the subgenre of fantasy. So this is really his 1930s defense of a subgenre, although he didn't know it at the time.
And really, the fantasy subgenre is just a derivation of what Tolkien wrote in Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, generally speaking, these days anyway. But we'll get into that. Before we do, hey, if you like what you're hearing, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, all those places, because more people find us, the conversation grows, and we have more interesting things to talk about because more people are involved. And to get involved, you can become a member at theonering.com/member. $4 a month. First month is free. You get our extended podcast, which today we're going to be talking about what our favorite fairy stories are. I guess, which means what are our favorite fantasy stories? There's a bunch of them in a sense for me. I don't even know. Now I'm like thinking. Anyway, we're gonna figure that out because I'm not sure what that would be necessarily. And then we'll talk about what is the best modern fairy story? What in the last 20, 25 years since say 2000? Is there something we can point to and say this here meets the criteria put forth by Tolkien in this essay on fairy stories? So we'll get into that in our extended podcast, and you can join us, ask questions in our Discord chat, join the conversation there, get the extended podcast. You can even go to our shop at shoptheonering.com, and there's an additional discount for you if you're a member. You can get that code by going to our Discord chat, and if you go there right now, you can actually get one of our awesome hats. We haven't gotten them yet, but our Make Tolkien Great Again hat in Tengwar, which both of you guys should be getting really soon in the next week or so.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. I've always wanted a hat that no one can understand. They just look at you dumbly as you walk by.
Right. And so, go to theonering.com/member, become a member. First month's free. And usually we would jump into All That Is Gold Does Not Glitter, but we don't have anything here since we're just jumping into On Fairy Stories. And usually after that, Dan would have a big thought. But he doesn't this week. I don't know what happened. Oh, we're done with the Silmarillion. It's not a thing anymore.
Wait, are you saying Dan doesn't get any more big thoughts now that we're done with the Silmarillion?
Yeah. Dan, you're still muted, Dan. There we go.
I said sad.
Sad. It's sad.
I said it for you.
So. But this week we're going to start with Michael, and I don't have a pithy statement for Michael. If somebody can come up with a great little stinger we can create for Michael's mid-afternoon musings.
Monotonous monologue.
That's a good one. I can just put that in whenever you do start talking. I'll just have it as a.
That's right. You have like a Michael's just a warning sign is flashing like Michael drones on. Great. Well, I will start us out this time because this was my aggressive push. I wanted us to read this, and I want us to read this for the reasons I said, because I think it helps us understand Tolkien a little better. The reading today is just about the first section of On Fairy Stories. On Fairy Stories is a very long essay. It's in some versions. The version I'm at right here, it's about 80 pages, and it's different in other versions, obviously, but it's a long essay. And the first 15 to 20 pages is what we're covering right now, which is Tolkien helpfully at the end of his second paragraph or so. I think it's his second paragraph. Third paragraph says that he tells us what he's going to do in this essay. And just so everyone knows context, this essay was 1939. Thank you, Jonathan, for correcting me on that.
I know my years.
Jonathan knows chronology, and especially Tolkien chronology. And so it was the late 30s. Tolkien's already published The Hobbit, and he's writing The Lord of the Rings at this point. So you have to kind of overlay that. I think it is helpful anyway. You don't have to, but it's helpful to overlay what you're hearing in On Fairy Stories. Note also, he was an Oxford Don. This is a academic who had just published what was regarded as a children's tale. And so this essay is, in a way, his apologia, is his defense of what he's doing with what we now call the fantasy subgenre of fiction. So he tells us, he says he's going to answer 3 questions in this essay, and today we're just going to talk about the first of those 3. The 3 questions he says he's going to answer are: 1, what are fairy stories? If you're going to talk about them, you should know what they are. So definition. 2, what is the origin of fairy stories? And question number 3, what's the use of fairy stories? And his treatment of each of those gets progressively longer. His definition section's the shortest. And so today we're just talking about the first part, which is what are fairy stories? And I think I was telling you guys beforehand, it's a funny way that he goes about doing it. He doesn't define it in a sort of systematic or obvious way. He defines it through what we call the via negativa, which is basically, he's like, what's a fairy story? And here are a bunch of people that write stories that aren't fairy stories. So I'm going to tell you what's wrong with these things. And through this this method of here's something called a fairy story or a fairy. First, here's something we call fairies. These aren't real fairies. This is all bunk. Then he goes into examples. Here's a fairy story, supposedly, but it's not. Alice in Wonderland, not a fairy story. Here's a fairy story. Gulliver's Travels, not a fairy story. Here's a fairy story. So he goes through a bunch of the fairy tales and tells us what a fairy story is, what isn't a fairy story, and on the way gives us these nuggets about what the characteristics of a fairy story are. And so I didn't know what did you guys think of his method there? Felt to me like a pub method.
Like a pub method.
Yeah, like he's sitting in a pub with a pint, and he's like, you know that book? That's not a fairy story.
Right. It's, I mean, he even points out, it's like, turn to the Oxford English Dictionary in vain, right? And so he's like, I'm going to give it to you, except I'm going to write about 80 pages of it. Here's my definition. So don't go there. But he defines it, I think, at least, and take umbrage with me at this if you feel that I'm wrong, in 2 ways. One is by what it has, and one is by what it isn't. He never defines it by what it is. Does that make sense? So, for instance, he says by what it has. Well, what it has are, here in fairy stories, men are the supernatural. Men are the things that are men, humans, humankind, are the invaders. They're the ones that are not natural to the world, right? That's one way he puts it. 2, it has magic, and magic is to be taken seriously. It cannot be satire. It's not a joke. Magic is the art of the world, so to speak, and that needs to be taken seriously. So those are 2 of the things that it has offhand. The other one is what it doesn't have is like, one, it's not a what do you call a traveler's tale?
Correct.
Where it's not like what you said, like Gulliver's Travels. It's not like where you go to, in our world, you just go to a magical island somewhere, and it's just a part of our world. Like it's not a magical island of just different things. That's still part of our world. And then the other one was a beast fable, right, where it's just full of talking beasts and where humans don't play a part. He doesn't make a point that talking beasts doesn't mean that that having a talking beast means that it's not a fairy story. It simply means that and maybe I read this wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but that if it's just all about talking beasts, like it doesn't hold the fairy story for
right. Well, let's go to that actually, if you want to talk about that part. But because it's very interesting. He says the beast fable, of course, has a connection with fairy stories. Beasts and birds and other creatures often talk like men in real fairy stories. In some part, often small, this marvel derives from, and I underline this part because this is a tidbit where he's actually telling us what fairy stories have, so it gives us some idea from a positive perspective. He says, one of the primal desires that lie near the heart of fairy, the desire of men to hold communion with other living things. So that's part of the world of fairy, is the desire to hold communion with other living things. But the speech of beasts in the beast fable, as developed into a separate branch, has little reference to that desire and often wholly forgets it. So he says, basically, if a beast fable is one in which the characters themselves are animals, I don't know if anyone's read the Redwall series, for example. It's a kid's series, and it's all the characters. It's like Martin the warrior. He's a mouse, and all the characters are animals of different kinds. And it's a heroic story, but all the characters, it's basically just humans, but with different animal cultures. And so you have the squirrel cultures and the rabbit and the mice cultures, and you have the bad animals and the wolverines and things like that. So that would be a beast fable. Aesop's fables is largely beast fables often, because all they are is moralizing in the form with beasts speaking in the words of a preacher or teacher.
Yeah. Or it would be the one, the more modern one that comes to mind is The Secret of Nim.
That's right.
Or Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, I think was the name of the original book.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's now that has some elements. It's interesting. That has some elements of what it might be more. That might be more like what he says Beatrix Potter does in a couple of her stories, where there's a kind of magic that's kind of liminal on the edge of the story. But basically most of the characters in the Secret of Nim are it's just a beast fable.
Yeah. But that's to say, like, these lines aren't precise either. Like, reading through this, you have to think about it, and you're like, well, parts of it are, parts of it aren't. But as a whole, maybe it hews more towards the beast fable or the dream. The dream tale is kind of.
Well, it has some elements of it. So the element of the beast fable is there are talking beasts and sometimes plants in fairy stories. So we know it's not a secret. Lord of the Rings, he would consider a fairy story.
Yeah.
So you have talking plants and Ents, and
I guess Old Man Willow. What are the other? Are there other? Yeah, okay.
So there are creatures that have and things that have eagles. How's that not a talking?
And the fox in the is it a fox in the Hobbit?
Well, the one-time fox that pops up once with one line.
What would you think if you saw it? Yeah.
Surprised at seeing hobbits so far out. Yeah. So there's definitely talking beasts, at least occasionally. Yeah. And if you watch the movies, the moth, right? No, but on a more serious note, Radagast is said to have speak in the speech of the beasts.
That's right.
But
that goes more towards that longing of like that is the element of it, is there's a longing to speak with them. It's not like we are living in the culture of all the foxes in the Shire where there are stories told about them. Right.
So I'm going to quote one passage here near the beginning of the reading, and after he kicks to the curb the Oxford English Dictionary of fairy stories, where he talks about really something that is what he's going to consider a real fairy story. And he says, "Now, though I've only touched wholly inadequately on elves and fairies, I must turn back," because he had just, as a philologist does, he had gone down a rabbit trail of talking about the origins of elves and fairies and that use in the English language. "For I have digressed from my proper theme, fairy stories. I said the sense stories about fairies was too narrow. It is too narrow, even if we reject the diminutive size. For fairy stories are not in normal English usage stories about fairies or elves, but stories about fairy. That is, fairy," and again he spells it Faerie, "the realm or state in which fairies have their being." Now, so this is an important principle. Fairy stories are about a different land. They are not about the land that is exactly the same as the one that we are in. So if you have a story about the land that we are in, and I'm going to use an example, the Space Trilogy, C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. That someone might argue that that's a kind of fairy story where the fairies are angels, etc. And there's other elements. And there is, in fact, Merlin comes back in that final book of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. But Tolkien would argue, I think, that that's not a fairy story because it's about our world in the modern times with some things that are coming in that are not normal. But but it's not about fairy, Faerie. It's not about the realm or state in which fairies have their being. So even though Tolkien did refer to Middle-earth as a kind of prehistorical place, the world in its prehistorical state, there's too much of fairy in that world. It's not, we don't recognize it as our world. We can't even really point. People have tried to look at the maps of Middle Earth and be like, this is Europe.
Well, and it's in that line where he says the realm or state in which fairies or elves really is, and he makes that as a that's his sort of a synonym in a way. But which fairies have their being. Once the fairies all leave, it is our world, right? And the world has grown. Right. It said at the end of Silmarillion, it has grown old and gray to them, so it's not their world anymore.
The world is changing, exactly. Valinor has been removed, to bring it back to our Silmarillion podcast, and the world is becoming gray and what's the word? What's the other adjective he uses?
Dull, gray, and old.
Dull, fading, and gray. No, gray and something else. I don't know if you.
I'll find it for you. Hang on a second. But yeah.
All right. So that's an interesting one, because I think that's his argument, that basically his fairy story is at an end. And it's time for actual history, which, interestingly, I will argue is the reason why he tried to write a sequel to or start a short story anyway about the Fourth Age, something that happened about 100 years after
Return of the Shadow, I think he called it.
It's called Return of the Shadow, and it only has a few pages, and then he just stopped and I would argue, having read those few pages, that he's no longer in the realm of a fairy story. It's like all the stuff that made his Lord of the Rings a fairy story. It's gone. Is gone. Yeah. It's faded away.
It's old and gray, as he says at the end.
That's right. And there might be a rumor of orcs. Exactly. There might be a place where orcs still exist, maybe, or people still worship the Dark Lord under some form or other, even though the Dark Lord is gone. But nevertheless, his world has lost its character as fairy story. So this is an important part of the definition of a fairy story. It's a story about the realm or state in which fairies have their being, which is why, for example, I think some of the fantasy works that the fantasy, if it's just historical fiction, if we just have historical fiction but with magic in it, that's not enough to make it a fairy story. There has to be this realm of fairy, or as he calls it, the perilous realm. And the perilous realm has magic. But he says, but it is a magic of a peculiar mood and power at the furthest pull from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician.
This just popped in my head. Because the whole idea that we live in a different world is integral to how he defines a fairy story, or that it is a different world than we are familiar with.
Yeah.
In science fiction, like in Star Trek, you could argue that the world of 300, 400 years now is a different world than where we live in, where there's magic, the science, or the different planets and the different things. Like, it is completely different than what we are in now, and there are different beings inhabiting that. Can we say that, in a sense, that is a fairy story, because it's not our world? It's not anything we're familiar with. We're invading sort of the rest of the universe, and all these things, these gnomes and elves, and they have different names, and science is essentially magic, because you can do things that would never be possible from what we know now, essentially, is science. So could there be an argument that that's sort of a modern fairy story?
I think there could be an argument. It would be a very interesting argument, but it would essentially, what you would have to argue was that you would have to show that the world that the characters experience and live in is one in which man is entering. There's always man in fairy stories. Yeah. And he's entering a place which has its own rules, even rules of physics that are different. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you might be able to run on the snow.
Walk on snow. Huh. Oh. How did I know you were going to say that?
I telegraph it now. That's just obvious. But there's rules that aren't our rules, and there are laws that aren't our laws, and it's not good to delve too deep. And so I can think of some. I mean, there's an element in the Dune Chronicles, for example, of this. Mm-hmm. And they go to the mind. There's elements in Star Trek in some of the episodes where they go to different planets where the rules are entirely different. And in those cases, I think you can make a case that those specific episodes might be, a kind of fairy story.
Okay. Yeah.
The entire one, when you look at the whole arc of like the Federation, and it's really a story about the future and mankind does, and that's a traveler's tale.
Yeah.
So that's what Tolkien calls a traveler's tale, where you're just going from planet to planet. But some of those planets, in some cases, maybe. I think you might be able to argue.
Like we said, it's wibbly wobbly edges here. Like it's hard sometimes to understand where it might start and where it might end, and where certain stories are fairy stories and certain other stories aren't. Anyway, okay. Sorry, I digress. That was the. Just pop.
Well, and that led to the quote that you gave us before. That I'm going to read the actual quote. There is one proviso. This is right after the one I just read. There is one proviso. If there is any satire present in the tale, one thing must not be made fun of: the magic itself. That must, in that story, be taken seriously, neither laughed at nor explained away. Of this seriousness, the medieval Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is an admirable example.
Nor explained away. Midi-chlorians.
Yep, exactly. Or Legolas running on snow. I know we keep going back to it, but I really do think it's important that you not be able to explain away the magic of the ring. How does Galadriel's ring work? How does it preserve Lothlorien? Once you start like trying to give an actual mechanistic reality,
how did Fëanor make the Silmarils? Right? It's like
that's right.
Like he was the greatest of his craft, but what was his craft? Well, he didn't really explain like how he captured the light of the trees.
You captured light, and so it burned unending. Like the Silmarils were like stars now; they produced their own light. Yeah. Well, how does that work? Was there nuclear fission going on, fusion going on all the time? Right. So you can't. It bears no fruit, and you've moved beyond fairy story, and that I would argue actually. This just came to me. That is the boundary between the subgenre of science fiction and the subgenre of fantasy, because I think Chesterton would agree with me on this, that there has to be a kind of wonder and a mystery to the world of fairy that there isn't in science fiction, or at least there doesn't have to be. And science fiction often explains what's going on, what's quote unquote really going on in fantastic situations. So there has to be this kind of mystery, and the magic has to be taken seriously. And by the way, I do think we should read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as one of our because Tolkien.
I've never read it.
Oh yeah, because he has a commentary on. It's great. It's awesome. So.
Go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to say one paragraph that I found interesting in this whole discussion. He's trying to define what fairy stories are and aren't, and he contrasts. I believe it's called Nymphidia, Drayton's Nymphidia, which is considered a fairy story, and he says one of the worst ever written. And then he compares it with Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot.
Yep.
And he says that's a good and evil story, and Arthur's court, that's a fairy story rather than this tale of Oberon. So he's talking about how in this other tale there's the knight riding on an earwig, and there's all these fantastical elements to it, but he's saying that doesn't fall under fairy story. And I'm wondering if I'm not really familiar with Nymphidia. I'm wondering if you could illuminate what you're talking about there.
I think what he's saying there is what we were just talking about. It takes place in our world. It's a story about fairies, riding on earwigs, living in the cowslips, the little bell-shaped, right?
Yeah, it's a story of what's happening beneath our notice.
Yeah, rather than a story in the realm of where fairy live, where they're in the realm of where humans live.
So he's saying that's about fairies, but it's not taking place in fairy,
right?
And humans are intruding into it,
right? And there is an element of magic in it that's so like he even mentions, he says, the gallant knight and angry husband fall into the mire. This is in the story of Nymphidia, and their wrath is stilled by a draught of the waters of Lethe. It would be better if Lethe had swallowed the whole affair. So the waters of Lethe, which is the waters of forgetfulness, and
it's kind of like, would you take Honey, I Shrunk the Kids to be a fairy story? No, because they're just little and they're flying around on bees.
But it's got a fantastic element, right? It's really cool. But now Nymphidia would have more of the magical element than Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Although I did think of that, Jonathan, too. But I think with a problem, there's many problems with Nymphidia, but one of them is one of the problems is he's going to get more into this later on in the essay. is that Nymphidia relegates the world of fairy stories to children's literature, which he thinks is a great mistake. That there's nothing wrong with fairy stories for children, but there's also nothing wrong with fairy stories for adults. And in fact, there's something to be gained by fairy story, crafting a fairy story for adults that you can't gain through a children's story. And so there's the sort of diminishment of the fairy story in Nymphidia, but also they don't take the magic seriously. And that's whereas in Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, and Morgan Le Fay, and everything about and Merlin, they take the magic very seriously, and in fact, it's tragic. And so that was what. And furthermore, as you mentioned, Dan, it's a tale with good and evil in it, not just silliness like Nymphidia.
It's like the quote. I reread Chesterton's Ethics of Elfland again before getting into this, and one of the quotes that stuck out to me that he says about it. And I think Tolkien was probably referencing some of what Chesterton wrote at some points, particularly Chesterton makes a point of like being in jail, and Tolkien makes a point of like that you like to escape is a good thing. Anyway, but Chesterton wrote, "Fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense." Which is interesting because it's like, it's not, then he wrote, it's not earth that judges heaven, but heaven that judges earth. So for me, at least, it was not the earth that criticized Elfland, but Elfland that criticized the earth. This is more the philosophy of fairy tales. But the whole idea that, it doesn't, being magical isn't, it like, just having magic in it doesn't make it a fairy story. It's taking it seriously. It's the common sense of it, right? Like, you don't have to explain it. But anyway, that's sort of a little bit of an aside, but even Chesterton had some thoughts that fairy stories weren't silly little things for children.
Yep.
Little, I don't know what a good example of a fairy story for kids is, because I tried to avoid them.
Now, and this part is interesting. He says most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm, or upon its shadowy marches. That's what you were referring to before. Naturally so, for if elves are true and really exist independently of our tales about them, then this also is certainly true. Elves are not primarily concerned with us, nor we with them. Our fates are sundered, and our paths seldom meet. That line, our fates are sundered and our paths seldom meet, that rang to me of the Silmarillion right there.
It totally did. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
highlighted too.
Like, I can imagine him writing that line and thinking of the sundering of the fates of elves and men in the Silmarillion, and how because again, the Silmarillion to me strikes me as a story about a fairy story that then by the end, through the end of in the Fourth Age, has become a not fairy story. It becomes prehistory at that point.
Yeah.
Which is sad, but also, the fate of elves and men are sundered.
Yeah.
So so what's implied by that? What he's saying is, if in order to write a good fairy story, you have to have a lot of elements. You got to have the element where the story is about a land that is not ours. It's a land which has its own existence. It has its own rules. That you can't question, or it's perilous to question anyways. It has its own people, and they have an existence aside from you, and they don't care. It isn't all about you, but the story is often about your adventure in that land, or men's adventure in the land. The character of that land is one of magic, but it's a serious magic. It's a magic, in other words, which has a structure, but it has a structure but little detail. So he never explains to us how Gandalf is able to turn pine cones into fireballs, or do a lot of the things that men consider magic, or the elves do things men consider magic. How does the elven rope untie itself when Sam tugs on it and it falls down after being firmly tied and bearing their weight all the way down the mean wheel cliff face?
Yeah.
You can't question it. You simply cannot. It doesn't bear any answer, and it isn't a good idea to ask. So there's these elements, and so a fairy story has to take magic seriously. It can have talking animals, but it can't be about talking animals. So the talking animals can't be the primary characters. Interestingly enough, the most talkingest of all the animals, which are the eagles, they're used as a eucatastrophic tool by Tolkien. They're not. We're told that they are their own people and they speak, and we have some dialogue with them, but they're not. We're not concerned to delve into their world.
I can see Tolkien writing the story of Beren Luthien. He's like, "Oh, this hound, it can talk." He's like, "No, it can't. Maybe a few times. Three times. Three times. That's it, guys. It's not a fairy. Come on, it's a fairy story.
Three times.
That's all I got for the hound to talk."
That's really interesting because I didn't think of that. That's fantastic, Jonathan, because that's I see exactly his paragraphs here about beast fables. He's like, if I have him talk too much, then he's a character, and if he's a character, then we're pushing the limits as far as fairy stories go, because this is not about talking animals, but occasionally you meet an animal that can talk.
Yeah. And it works. Yeah, it's okay. We'll accept it. And we don't explain why he can talk or how he can talk or what makes him, I mean, other than he's sent from the Valar, but it's not a...
What kind of explanation is that? That's
right. Yeah.
It's enough of an explanation.
And the other thing is, of course, like, all of this can't be a dream. Like,
the dream.
Alice in Wonderland, it's right out. Just toss it aside. Can't do that. I don't know.
There was one. Okay, so in there was one sentence in the paragraphs where he was saying it can't be a dream tale, where he says, "It is true that dream is not unconnected." That's capital D, dream. Is not unconnected with fairy. So he's saying, look, there's a connection here between these two kinds of tales. In dreams, strange powers of the mind may be unlocked. In some of them, a man may for a space wield the power of fairy, that power which, even as it conceives the story, causes it to take living form and color before the eyes. And then later he says, but if a waking writer tells you that his tale is only a thing imagined in his sleep, he cheats deliberately the primal desire at the heart of fairy. So now what he's doing is he's telling us, here's why a dream tale can't be a fairy story. What's the primal desire at the heart of fairy? The realization, independent of the conceiving mind, of the imagined wonder. So once you say, I had this fantastic tale like Alice down in the Looking Glass, Alice, oh shoot, I just now I'm muddling the titles.
Through the Looking Glass.
Through the Looking Glass. Thank you. Once you tell them, well, this was all because Alice was dreaming. Well, then it isn't a fairy story anymore because we are forever in doubt about whether there is in fact Humpty Dumpty, whether there is in Tweedledee and Tweedledum, whether there is a Queen of Hearts. We don't know. Maybe there is, and she touched it, or maybe there isn't.
Well, and if it's a dream, it's happening in our world. Ultimately, right? You could say that you've never actually left. You've never actually entered the realm of fairy.
Right. Now, someone might quibble and say, well, look, her body never left, but her mind entered this other world. Okay. But even so, the fact that it was a dream throws everything into doubt. Tolkien would say that the primal desire at the heart of fairy is the realization. That's realization. That's not the mind realizing something. That's the realization, the making real, independent of the conceiving mind of the imagined wonder. So elves are real in fairy, dragons are real in fairy, and so is everything else. Doesn't matter whether you dream about it or not. They have their own existence.
Yeah, and simply by making it a dream, all of a sudden everything is not real. I mean, you've lost the seriousness of it.
Or if you fudge the edges anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And sometimes you've just completely lost it. And it's just, Interestingly, I'd forgotten that he does mention H.G. Wells' The Time Machine as a side
Morlocks
note.
And the Eloi.
Yeah. The Eloi and the Morlock.
Could be. Well, it's kind of like what we were talking about with Star Trek, actually, in a way.
Exactly. And he says they're closer to a fairy story than Gulliver's Travels and the Lilliputians. Why? Because, quote, Eloi and Morlocks live far away in an abyss of time so deep as to work an enchantment upon them. So, and if they are descended from ourselves, it may be remembered that an ancient English thinker once derived the Ylf, the very elves, through Cain from Adam. Man,
even he here is saying like the edges are blurry. Like you could be thinking like this is more of a fairy story.
If you go far
not.
enough in time, you could get to a point where it's almost like it's but he doesn't say that it was. I don't think he would say that the time machine is a fairy story. I do think he would distinguish. He just says it gets close. But I don't think it would ever pass the true test. So the final one I wanted to point out was when he brings up the beast fable. He says that the nearness of some beast fables to fairy stories lies in their strong moral element. So there has to be then that what he's saying indirectly is there has to be, and he said it before about the Arthurian legends, there has to be a strong moral element to a fairy story. In other words, it's not enough to have a fantastic world which has its own reality and its own rules, which we might call magic, in which humans adventure in it and encounter the wonders. But there has to be a moral element to it too, which there is in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, by the way, which I'm looking forward to reading at some point. But with you
define a moral element. What are we talking about? Are we saying that you learn like it's a morality tale? I don't think that's what he means, if you ask me. Or does it mean that morality is defined within it?
I think it's more of the latter. I think it's one that has a moral structure. So there is, in fact, a good and an evil.
Yes.
And that is made clear by the actions of the denizens of Faërie. So you may not understand why they do what they do, but it is clear through their actions that there is good and there is evil, and some of them act for one and some act for the other. And sometimes people in Faërie act for both, and just like outside of Faërie. So you've talked way too much in this, Dan. I thought.
I'm sorry. Just keeping up with the conversation because I'm not super familiar with fairy stories. I guess this is like the world of Tolkien might be one of my gateways, other than I guess like Disney movies maybe, or children's tales.
I mean, you could say the most successful fairy story of the last 75 years is Star Wars, because it meets most of the criteria here that we're talking about, right? Because it is buried in the depths of time. It's a different world.
Depths of time. So it's at that liminal edge. Okay, so you got that. It's got its own rules. So you have the magic, which they call the Force.
Taken seriously.
It is taken seriously. It's very serious. It has all these wonders. It has its own existence that human beings are adventuring in these places. Although they do travel to different worlds, it's not a traveler's tale. You aren't just jumping from place to. It isn't Star Trek. Star Trek is a traveler's tale. It's like following as they go from place to place, or Gulliver's Travels. So it isn't that. I agree. That's interesting. It has its own moral structure. That is true as well. Strong moral element.
It's not a dream.
It's not a dream. No, no.
Yeah, and the fairies just happen to be midi-chlorians.
Well, that's where they fail. So they fail by explaining away the Force. Once you start to try to explain the magic, you're failing. So I would say episodes 4, 5, and 6 are definitely in the running for a kind of science fiction fairy story. Yeah, interesting. Which is sometimes, I guess it could help us understand a little bit why sometimes sci-fi and fantasy are grouped together, because they do have a kind of typical element to them. I'm sorry,
and a lot of people never called Star Wars science fiction; they called it science fantasy. That was the name that a lot of people put onto it, because it's a fantasy story that simply takes place in a little more technological world. But the magic of the technology is just as mysterious as the magic of sailing in a straight path to Valinor. You don't have to explain what hyperspeed is, and they don't even get into the details of warp cores and all the different kinds of I can't even remember all the tachyon beams and things like that in Star Trek, where they try to explain it all away. Whereas in Star Wars, they just accept that you're going to go for it.
Yeah. I agree.
I think that Star Wars would be a fairy tale or a fairy story if you didn't have the Jedi and the Force, though. If it was just the technology being fantastical.
Well,
I don't think so.
I think you need to have the space wizards.
Those I think are the fairy that inhabit the world. Right? They're the things that define Star Wars, because everything revolves. I mean, that's why every character in every story pretty much has tried to revolve around the Jedi, because
all the primary antagonists and protagonists the heroes and the major villains are all about the Force. So yes, it's the magic with a capital M that Tolkien uses in this essay that Star Wars revolves. It even has it's the Force with a capital F, right?
Yeah.
So I do think actually I am somewhat convinced. I have to think more about it. I'm only somewhat because I want to think about it, but I do think it starts to meet those elements, and it is interesting how they don't try to, like, unlike Star Trek, unlike some of the hard sci-fi that I enjoy greatly, the Foundation series, Asimov's books. They don't try to explain the technology. That just is what it is, and you just don't, and especially the Force. You can't ask too many questions about the Force until episode 1 comes around.
That's so sad. I think that was that was Jar Jar to me when they went into the midichlorian level. Like, I can accept Jar Jar, but once you start trying to explain the Force away, you lose the magic of it.
Yeah, they kind of explained it in a way where, like, if Anakin had sneezed on somebody, then he could have given them the Force,
infected them with the Force. He had so many midichlorians that is just like spewing it all over the place.
Oh man, yeah. Well, are there any other thoughts regarding this first part? Because this is I think the first of 4 episodes that we're going to talk about on fairy stories.
It is interesting that what we get is Tolkien jaunting very quickly through a bunch of fictional literature that's all kind of fantastical, and he's like checking the box, not fairy story, kind of a fairy story. So Lang has some tales. Andrew Lang's, famously Andrew Lang, for those that never saw it, had 25 books on fairies, fairy books of different colors that he would do, and different other things.
I looked it up. Yeah, he has a lot of them, and they're the different color ones. I think there are 12 of them, but he just gathered all these different fairy stories or fairy tales.
Exactly. He's kind of like a Grimm Brothers in that regard. He's like the English version of the Grimm Brothers, where he's gathering up all these tales. So Tolkien takes down, he says some of them aren't fairy stories, but some of them are. So he's kind of yes, no on Lang. George MacDonald gets a yes. He has, and then the author of Sir Gawain Green Knight gets a yes. Most other people get a no. None of the Alice in Wonderland tales are fairy stories. None of the Beast tales are fairy stories. Jonathan Swift gets a no on the fairy story, on his satire, Gulliver's Travels, and a bunch of other people besides. He even kicks Beatrix Potter to the curb, and
it would be so interesting to hear him
and Brer Rabbit too. He kicks Brer Rabbit to the curb.
Yeah, poor guy. So did the fox.
Oppression. It never ends.
But so what would Tolkien say about all the stuff that's come up in the last 50 years? Because you could say fairy story was inspired an entire generation of writers. Too much to copy him, but 2, to try and figure it out without the basis, without some of the boundaries that he put in around it.
Yep. That
made it great.
To me, Tolkien, and I know this is going to sound a little overly maybe theological to some people, he's like the sower. He came along and he took a bunch of seeds and he threw them all over the ground everywhere. And some of the seeds sprang up and they bore fruit, and some sprang up quickly and then died quickly, and some didn't bear any fruit. And some of the seeds were like turned into 1960 Chevrolets, and so they were just different. People took it.
He's Johnny Fantasy Seed.
That's right. Johnny. That's right. He is the Johnny Appleseed of the fiction, of this kind of fiction world, because there has been that explosion, and everyone with any sense, even some of the writers of great, like George R. R. Martin, fantastic talent. Utterly opposite to everything I stand for in terms of morals, but he has a tremendous talent. Gives credit to Tolkien for his work smartly, because for so much of his inspiration and everybody that writes, some people just blatantly copying, like the Shannara series, which I cannot stand, and it's such a copy that I can't stand it. But other people pulling from it, like Michael Scott Rohan and others, they're just. He's the Johnny Appleseed. You're right, Jonathan. He's the Johnny Appleseed of the literary world, and he sowed, and then other people reaped and sowed of their own, and to lesser or greater extent, sometimes even in the field of science fantasy.
His insight into some of these stories would just be brutal.
Yeah, he takes down everyone, basically, and he would come with the scythe, and he would be the reaper, and he would destroy most. But I think there would be people. I could see him, Ursula Le Guin. Wow, McGuinn. That's terrible. Ursula Le Guin. I could see him liking some of her stuff. I could see him liking some of the writers of the last 50 to 80 years, and the work that they did. And if they could capture that magic element, if they could capture that element where there's a real, it feels like you're in a real place. And as we read through this essay, we're going to get more into that. We're going to get more into what does he actually think. He uses that great phrase. We haven't got to it yet, but he says secondary world in the next reading, because that's what you're really aiming for. You're aiming for another world when you write fairy stories. And so that's what we're gonna. That's what's coming up. But bear with us as we go through this.
Yeah. So I think we'll probably get into this more in the subscriber only portion. But I think it's interesting that in this essay or this lecture that he gave came at a time when it seems like he had finished reading The Hobbit and was still working on The Lord of the Rings, and it kind of seems like his thinking on fairy stories was either becoming more solidified, and that might explain some of the tonal differences between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
Yes,
where it seems like the elves they're like comical. It's almost in The Hobbit.
Yeah,
whereas he makes everything more serious and more.
Didn't he try
more
to
real? I guess.
Did I read somewhere that at some point that he tried to rewrite The Hobbit at some point to make it a little more in the style of The Lord of the Rings? I feel like he started that and never finished, and he wanted.
I heard the same thing, but I don't know. I can't remember where I heard it from.
I feel like that was in a letter, or okay. So, but yeah, I think you're right, Dan. That he was still trying to figure it out. And if you go back all the way to the Book of Lost Tales, it's a story of a mariner who goes to a separate enchanted land where the fairy live, the elves. And they tell him all these stories of the land, and that's where everything was birthed out of for the Silmarillion. So he had it in his head, but he would also tell these fantastic tales to his kids, and that's kind of, I think, where his fiction was at, like his prosaic fiction, just the story was in his mind, was at what he would do with his kids. And so in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. That's where I think that came out of. And over the next 15 years, he slaved over trying to figure out how to bring the Silmarillion and the Hobbit in together into the Lord of the Rings. And he was so frustrated and disappointed. And I think he read, like, at one point in 1939, he went through a big depression because he didn't know where to go with this, the Hobbit and the sequel to it. And I bet you're right. A large part of this is, like, after he wrote this, he's like, oh crap, what did I do with the Hobbit? Like, I gotta, like, this next thing's gotta, like, be within these boundaries, and, like, I've got to take it seriously. And there's none of this dancing, prancing elves and foxes who think about hobbits on the side of the road.
Yeah, well, that is very interesting. And I think we're probably going to cover On Fairy Stories in 2 more readings, 2 more weeks. And this next reading, I'm going to suggest anyway, we do the next 2 sections, which is the longest one. We'll do 30 pages this time, and then maybe 28 the last. That's from my edition. But the next 2 sections are the origins of fairy stories, and then
children.
What the use of the fairy stories is for children. And you'll see, I think, when we read the section on children, his divided thought about that. Like, he loves children, he loves the idea of fairy stories for children, but he hates the idea that they should be relegated to children's stories. Yeah. And so there's going to be some development of his thought in the next reading, which is those 2 sections. So that'll be our reading next time.
All right.
Origins and children.
All right. So next week, and I think we might have a little break in there because I know you're doing some traveling, so we might get that interview up in the meantime over the next few weeks. We'll see.
Yeah, my travel is the middle of July, I could do
everything's a week late. So we'll see. Maybe we should. Well, maybe we'll get them in. So we'll see. But if you are reading On Fairy Stories, and next week we're going to go into the children part of it.
Mm-hmm. All that is gold does not glitter.
That's totally wrong. That's not the one I meant to click on. I meant to click on this.
If you like Tolkien.
but I have to get the All That Is Golden every once in a while. So, hey, if you like Tolkien, I mentioned reading Chesterton's Ethics of Elfland. It's very difficult to read because, like, reading Chesterton and Tolkien at the same time, I'm like, oh, Tolkien's so approachable. and Chesterton just it feels like half the time you're reading Chesterton, it's train of thought. Didn't he dictate a lot of it to somebody and they wrote it down? I feel like that's true.
That's a good question.
And
I think
maybe that
at the end he did. Yeah.
Okay. In any case, he goes a lot into children, and I think he even starts about the whole idea that like when children say "do it again," that's not a bad thing. That's because they enjoy it and they are in this story that they're living inside their head, the fairy story, the gloriousness of this world. And anyway, it might be a good read. It's chapter 4 of Orthodoxy by Chesterton, which is in the public domain, so you can kind of get it everywhere. Or you can spend like 99 cents if you want to get a downloadable one on Kindle and put it on there. But it's worth reading. It's hard to read. I'll throw a plug for Ethan Nicole's Chesterton's Gateway, I think, which is a great way of approaching it. Even he writes, he's like, I don't really get what Chesterton's saying in this here all the time, and it's really hard. But it's worth it for some of those lines about tradition and democracy and how children approach things. There's like you can glom onto just certain parts of it and get a lot out of it. So I recommend that if that's something we're going to be going into next week.
I totally agree. Chesterton is like the hardest. He's like the red meat of the literary world. He is the hardest to digest, but you get the most out of it if you can get through him. Yeah. He's writing at a time when the art of writing itself, I believe, early 20th century was at its height in the English language, the art of developed writing and on topics and speeches and such. Yeah. So it's difficult, but worthwhile if you can get through it.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So that's the recommendation this week. We're going to jump into our members only section, our extended podcast with, hey, if you haven't heard, like, I just want some of you guys to listen to this is what you're missing every time we go on the extended podcast, which is Austin Robertson's wonderful reading.
Did you think it would end this way? Oh, the journey doesn't end here. The grey rain curtain of this episode will be rolled back, and all will turn to silver glass. And then you hear it. Distant sounds like waves on diamond shores. A far greater episode under a swift sunrise.
That's what you're missing each week every time you don't become a member at theonering.com/member and get the extended podcast.
But sadly, wait, is this still YouTube?
This is still YouTube. This is still
you just
all
wanted
the
to give them
freeloaders, man.
Sadly, you're all still freeloaders. So
that is true. But you can
kick you to the curb.
It's really easy, guys.
Say goodbye.
Yeah, we'll say goodbye. Okay, so for all of you all who are longtime listeners who like the extended podcast and want to listen to what we have to say, we're going to get into what our favorite fairy stories are, maybe what the best modern one is over the last 23 years. I'm going to leave out Star Wars because we already talked about that. But yeah. Join us there in the extended podcast, everybody. Michael?
Bye, freeloaders.